most people seem to be seated now or ready to go. Joy Tato, my name's Bernie Hawke. I'm the Group Manager Arts and Culture with the Dunedin City Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here tonight for the opening of our Keepsakes exhibition. Another wonderful exhibition from our heritage collections we're so proud to show off and have the community can see and enjoy. These exhibitions don't just happen, so I'd really like to, before I introduce our guest speaker, just acknowledge some of the people who've contributed to this exhibition. I think first and foremost I should go back to the founding City Librarian McEwan, whose foresight prevailed through the century to start collecting materials and memorabilia relating to the First World War. So the city does indeed owe a debt of gratitude to Bill McEwan. But a bit more recently, I'd like to acknowledge Dallas Sunley. Dallas has been the curator for this exhibition and has single-handedly curated the exhibition, and I believe has enjoyed the process of discovering some of the gems that we've had in our collection as the exhibition has been developed. I'd like to acknowledge Kathleen McCarthy and all of the bindery team who've done a great job preparing the mounts and all the presentation for the exhibition. For those with a keen interest in book preservation, you'll know that we have to be pretty careful about how we handle and present these items, and we really don't want them to fall apart. So acknowledgements to Kath and all the bindery team for that good work. I'd like to acknowledge Casey Thomas for, again, the fabulous graphic design work that's part of this exhibition and the really neat way that she's managed to sort of incorporate the World War commemoration logo into this design. And really, in mentioning Dallas, I'm singling her out, but acknowledgement needs to go to the whole Heritage Collections team, because it is a team effort, and while Dallas is doing this, the rest of the team are doing something else that Dallas is not doing, so it really does become a team effort. I'd like to acknowledge Keith Scott, who kindly lent some family mementoes displayed in the exhibition in one of the tall cases. So there's that one just there near the door. So thanks very much, Keith, for providing those materials for us. And another interesting item is you will have noticed the TV screen here, and what that is showing is some of the trip ship magazines that have been digitised by the Auckland War Memorial Museum, and we've contributed some of our collections to that national project, and we're delighted to be part of that project and also to be a beneficiary of the output of it as well. So a little bit about the exhibition. It's really just sort of quite a miscellaneous collection of items that we have in our collection. Some of them are quite curious. There's a tiny letter written at Gallipoli on a cigarette box, which was probably the only thing that was to hand at that time. We've got evidence of aerial bombings of Gallipoli and the propaganda that's been dropped from some of the planes. So that's a collection item that will never come again, and it's important that we have that in our collection. And I won't spoil it for you because there's a whole range of treasures there. So really now it's my pleasure to introduce Ron Polensky as our guest speaker this evening. Ron will be known to many people for his sports writing. What may not be as well known is that Ron is also an enthusiast on military history and has in fact written a number of books on that subject. One including Men of Valour, New Zealand and the Battle for Crete, and another one called Kiwi Battlefields. So Ron is an accomplished journalist, writer, and it's our pleasure to welcome him to speak to us tonight.
Thanks very much, Bernie. Tēnā koutou. Katoa. I feel a wee bit daunted speaking here tonight, but it's a great pleasure, and thank you very much, Lorraine, for inviting me to talk about Keepsakes, Rediscovered Secrets of the Great War. I had a wee sneak preview of this yesterday, and I thought that it was a tribute to a sort of a three-part tribute, really. One that it was a tribute to the people who worked on it, people who put together, beginning with Lorraine and Dallas and Kath. I saw them all in action yesterday. So it's a tribute to their skills that you're able to see all this. A tribute to William Barker McEwan. If I talk about him to you, I know I'm preaching to the converted. But it was he who saw the need to collect pamphlets and magazines. And he said that the value of such a collection is not for the present moment. Its usefulness will be more apparent in future years when our children and grandchildren come to read. So you can decide for yourselves whether your children or grandchildren or even younger, but we're the people he had in mind when he wrote all these hundreds of letters around the world, seeking and begging for troopship magazines and generally ephemera about the war. So it's very much a tribute to him. And of course, Dunedin, as Bertie said, Dunedin owes him a great debt of gratitude for what he did by setting up the library in Murray Place. I can just imagine the glee that one Scot had taking money off another Scot can't set it up. But he, he obviously had a great bookman's eye in collecting thousands of books, and it was to his great credit that the McNabb collection ended up here and not at another place. So that's two tributes. The other tribute, of course, is to the men and women of the period during the Great War. Not just the men who fought in the Great War, or the women who went away as nurses, but to everyone who was involved in one way or another, either away from their homes or at their homes, because it's an obvious truism, but one that's often overlooked, that for every soldier, for every male soldier, there was a mother. There was also quite often a wife, there were quite often sisters, and they were very much involved as well as the men, not in the sharp end, not in the risk of being killed, but in the commitment to their country's cause, in the worry. Some of the men were having a good time at times. The women weren't, because they had no idea where their men were. In some cases they were without their men for 4 or 5 years. They had, most of the time, had no idea where they were. They were worried. There are lots of examples where they would receive a telegram, for example, saying that so-and-so had been injured, had been wounded, and that he was recovering in hospital, only to read in the paper a couple of days later that he'd actually died. Or the opposite case, where they'd get a telegram saying, the Minister of Defence regrets to advise that so-and-so's died, and then they get a letter from him and find that he hadn't died after all. And there are lots and lots of mistakes like that are well documented. So when we talk about the Great War, and as we remember it, the beginning of it in August, and as we remember it over the next 4 years, we should be thinking all the time, not just of the soldiers who went away to fight, but of everyone who was involved at that time. When I had a look here yesterday, I was both surprised and delighted to see that there was a letter just here from Malcolm Ross to Mark Cohen. Being all erudite people I know, you know who those two men are. So I'll just remind myself that Malcolm Ross was originally a Dunedin journalist, began work on the Otago Daily Times. He was born on Settle Hill, but he ended up in Wellington as a parliamentary correspondent and a mountaineer, a very well-known man in New Zealand before the First World War. He became the only New Zealand official war correspondent during the First World War. Mark Cohen, as I'm sure you all know, was editor of the Evening Star after George Bell, so from, I can't remember the exact age, but from about, I say, 1885 until 1920, when he was promoted, kicked upstairs to the Legislative Council. But, interestingly, this letter was written in 1927, and from the date, it was about 3 months before Mark Cohen died. He was in Auckland at the time. And it was about 2 years before Malcolm died, and I know that Malcolm Ross wasn't very well at the time. His last few years were not very pleasant for him. But anyway, McEwan had obviously written to Malcolm Ross asking him for a copy of the magazine produced on the troop ship Tahiti. And Malcolm Ross says, and then he obviously didn't get a reply, so he's obviously asked Mark Cohen, can you just hurry this bloke along a bit? And so Mark Cohen, even when he was ailing and near dead, hurried Malcolm Ross along, and Malcolm Ross has said, basically, sorry, it's among all my war things, and I haven't had a chance to look, but I will. What intrigued me was that why he had a copy, if he did indeed have a copy of the magazine from the Tahiti, because he went to war on a ship called the Morea, and he came back on the Corinthic, so he had nothing to do with the Tahiti. So it must have been the stuff that he collected, because in addition to his role as war correspondent, in which he was working for the government, by the way, not for a particular newspaper, so his dispatches came to the government in Wellington, and then were sent from the government to New Zealand Press Association in Wellington, and they sent them to all the daily newspapers.
How did the dispatches get there? Is this by telegram?
We'll come to that if you want to talk on Malcolm Ross. I can go all night on him. But I'll just finish this wee story. Part of the brief that he got when he was appointed in 1915 was that not only was he going to be war correspondent, but he had to collect artefacts for an eventual New Zealand War Museum. So he religiously, the other thing was that he was going to write the official war histories, just as Charles Bean did in Australia. Well, sadly that never happened. Neither did the museum. But during the war, while Ross was on Gallipoli, and then he was in France, then he went to Germany when they were part of the occupation force in Cologne, he collected all this stuff. And he used to write to relatives back in New Zealand about all the stuff that he had in his house in London, because his wife had moved into a house in London. There was stuff full of stuff that he had nicked or borrowed, and I don't know where it is. And he must have had it when he wrote to Mark Cohen in 1927. He must have had it in his house in Hill Street, which is just runs down beside Parliament. He died 3 years later, and it's not in Turnbull Library, it's not in archives. The Ross family don't know where it is. So it's one of the great puzzles of what happened to all this priceless stuff. What was the question?
How did he contact the New Zealand government? I mean, was he vetted by the police?
Yeah. He had a great many issues because he was working for the government. When he first went to Gallipoli, his instructions were that he was only allowed to post his stories to the High Commissioner of London, Sir Thomas Mackenzie, and Mackenzie would send what he thought fit back to Wellington. So journalists wouldn't be very happy with that. And at some stage, Heaton Rhodes from Christchurch went to Gallipoli to look into postal services and other complaints from the troops, and he looked into Malcolm Ross's complaint as well. And Ross, after that, was able to cable short pieces if they were urgent enough, and that's what he did for the rest of the war. So he was cabling about 3 or 4 paragraphs and then posting the longer stuff. But with the result, though, that I'll give you an example. When Arthur Bockett was killed, for example, was that August 1915? Malcolm Ross wrote about it in a cable and said a well-known New Zealand colonel was killed, but he wasn't allowed to name him. In the meantime, the other correspondents on Gallipoli, especially the Reuter guy, was able to cable the whole story, including Bockett's name. By the time Malcolm Ross's posted story arrived, it was about 3 or 4 months later, and everyone knew. And Ross got a lot of blame for that, and his reputation really suffered during the war because of those restrictions. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on and on about Malcolm Ross. I'll just talk a wee bit too about Otago's role in the war. I read somewhere, it might be in this wee red book, or it might have been in stuff that Lorraine sent me about Otago's contribution in terms of manpower, military manpower to the war was disproportionately high, and I think that's right. But so are the casualties. I'm involved as George is with the few World War I things that are happening around town, and we worked out at one stage that for the duration of the war, the combined casualties of the Otago Infantry Battalion, or it was just called the Otago Battalion, or the Otago Regiment, and the Otago Mounted Rifles combined were greater than any other regionally based force from New Zealand. So greater than Auckland, Wellington, Canterbury battalions. And interestingly, the Otago Mounted Rifles were the only one of the mounted rifle battalions that went to France after Gallipoli. The rest of them stayed in Palestine and Gaza. So the only New Zealand military unit that had casualties greater than the combined total of those from Otago was the New Zealand Rifle Brigade, which of course was a national organisation, not one based regionally. Just talking about some of the stuff here, I guess it's very much in the eye of the beholder, and there are some things that might make you smile, might make you laugh. There are some things that, that might make you want to cry, make you sad. Some things that might even, or there's one that might even horrify you. But I think that's the good thing about this exhibition, is that it's representative of what the war was like for the people at the time. And we've got a great deal of hindsight. We know the consequences, and we know that one war led to another, and all this sort of stuff. These people didn't. And I think that what we see here is a good representation of what happened during the war. You may think that there's a lot of trivial stuff like sport. A lot of, and soldiers did play a lot of sport, especially rugby. Sorry, Lorraine, I promise not to mention rugby. And there's a lot of menus there, so they ate a lot, especially the officers. They ate quite well at times. And if you're eating well, then you're also drinking well. And there's quite a lot of that as well. But I think that's a counterpoint to the other side of war, which is what we all know it is. The other thing that struck me when I was looking here is that it doesn't tell you anything about the horrendous casualty figures. It doesn't tell you anything about, in fact, I don't even think it mentions Passchendaele or the Somme. It may do, okay. But there's no diorama showing that where the New Zealanders were and how many were killed on this day, and there's nothing there telling you that more than 800 New Zealanders died on October the 12th, 1917. There's nothing about the great men of the war. There's nothing about the generals. Nothing about even the leading New Zealanders at the time, and some of them were Dunedin people. Sir James Allen, as you well know, was Defence Minister throughout the war, acting Prime Minister for a fair bit of it when Massey and his mate Ward were off persuading the British to look after them. He was from Dunedin, well-known Dunedin figure, but I don't think he's mentioned in there. I don't recall seeing his name. Robin, the Army Commandant in Wellington, he was from here. Don't think he's mentioned in there. Tom Mackenzie, who I mentioned before, was the High Commissioner in London, and because he was the senior diplomat for New Zealand in London, he had an awful lot to do with the welfare of New Zealand soldiers, particularly looking after New Zealand soldiers who were in the many, many hospitals in southern England that New Zealanders were sent to. So I think it reflects the ordinary people rather than most books will tell you that about the battles and the commanders and all that stuff, but this reflects the ordinary people. If you can describe people who lived through the war as ordinary, and I don't believe you can, I think that are very extraordinary people. There are also some sad tales, really poignant tales, and I'll just mention this one here because I'm standing next to it. But there's a card here you'll see. It was a Christmas card in 1917, and it's got a soldier lounging against a rock, I think it is, and having a smoke, and it says Aotearoa and smoke. And the artist was Billy Bell, or I can't remember his proper name, William Frederick Bell. He was known as Billy Bell, and he came from Rankeela Street in South Dunedin, runs down by off Hillside Road down by TAB. he went through the war, very promising artist. The year before the war, this year, centenary this year, 1914, some of his work was hung in a Otago Art Society exhibition for the first time. So he was regarded as a very promising artist. He went to Gallipoli in 1915, went through the war, and then he was waiting for a ship home in 1918, and he died of rheumatic fever. So sadly, there are lots of stories like that about guys who got through the war, got through all the difficult fighting, and then succumbed to something else at the last minute. And there were a lot of the something elses. Am I allowed to talk rugby now? Just briefly, I'll finish on rugby if you don't mind. One of the great values in Mac's collecting of these troopship magazines was that that they are here, and as you know, there was an exhibition of them 4 or 5 years ago. But now that they're digitised, anyone can see them online. And I was researching. I was researching recently Dave Gallagher, the captain of the 1905 All Blacks, who was killed at Passchendaele. And I was able to, through these troopship magazines, I was able to follow his movements from Auckland to Wellington to Britain and then to France through the troopship magazine. And he was appointed the sports officer on the troopship. Can't remember which one it was. Might be the Taki. Anyway, he was appointed the sports officer on the troopship, and because it was Dave Gallagher, such a revered figure then, the ordinary soldiers he was a sergeant, but the ordinary soldiers just did whatever he told them to do because he was such a notable figure. It'd be a bit like Richie McCaw today, being on a troop ship and saying, you're going to be up at 6 o'clock running around the deck. And they would be. The other thing I found from these troop ship magazines was that one taking a bunch of reinforcements for the Maori contingent called in at Durban, and they had a rugby match. And it wasn't just Maori on the troop ship, obviously, but the troop ship formed the rugby team, and 2 Maori were in the rugby team, and they played in Durban. So I was able to work out they were the first Maori to play rugby in South Africa. That's the end of my rugby story. But you can see the great value in what Mac started to do and what Elizabeth Bryant continued, and what others, these people here are continuing as well. It's just to inform, as Mac said, the children and the grandchildren, and it's now our responsibility to inform future children and future grandchildren. So thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much, Ron, for a fascinating insight into some of the many stories that interweave with this collection. I like the image that you used about there being extraordinary people, and I like that this collection is just a window onto the extraordinary lives of people who travelled to the Great War. So please join with me again in thanking Ron. So we'd like you to have the opportunity to have a look at the exhibition. Please take one of the attractive catalogues if you'd like one, and just enjoy the rest of the evening. There's still some drinks and refreshments left, but if you are enjoying the refreshments, we'd ask you not to take them into the collection. So thanks very much for coming, everyone. Good evening.